Well, the only way that can happen, says Rawls, is for purposes of the basic structure of society. It is essential that the vast majority, not all, the vast majority of these comprehensive doctrines has to have a bare minimum of certain values in common. And these values can be very simple values like, very uncontroversial values like, if you know your neighbor disagrees with your comprehensive doctrine, and based on your neighbor's take, he would or she would vote for people who disagree with your comprehensive doctrine. And it's election day and your neighbor is on his way to the polls, you are not supposed to take out your gun and shoot your neighbor. Okay, so if you can agree on that, if you can agree on very, very basic principles of mutual respect, rights, the goals of a democratic society, pretty simple stuff, very limited, you've got enough agreement to make the basic structure get going. And once you get the basic structure going, you can add on extra details, you can add on a lot of stuff, but it's the basic structure that Rawls is interested in. And that's the level of consensus you need, says Rawls, to get consensus on this. So he calls this the overlapping consensus. And the overlapping consensus is all this stuff here is all the stuff that we disagree about, but if we just disagree about this core common area of basic democratic values, we can have a just, fair society in its basic structure. Now notice there's that comprehensive doctrine out here that doesn't participate in the overlapping consensus. For example, that could be a skinhead comprehensive doctrine that says certain people should be denied rights solely on the basis of race. You're just not going to have agreement with those folks, okay? Rawls thinks that if these are in the minority, a small minority of all the comprehensive doctrines, you could still get going. You don't need to get everybody to agree. You can get the vast majority of people to agree, and then you could go ahead saying this is a just and fair, justifiable basic structure for society. So this leads, I think, to this minimal view of toleration, religious toleration. Citizens should engage in public debate and discourse in the public square, ideally always using appeals to the overlapping consensus only, not to the parts of their comprehensive doctrines that differ, but always appealing to values and reasons that are translatable to that area of overlapping consensus. Each of us should basically check our comprehensive doctrines at the door when we go into the public square to have debate about public issues. Even if our comprehensive doctrine informs the views that we take on public matters, we should translate those views into terms that can be stated ideally solely in terms of that area of overlapping consensus. And you could make this an even stronger argument by saying that if we don't do that, we really indicate disrespect for others' divergent comprehensive doctrines. If I insist on invoking my comprehensive doctrine when I walk into the public square to have a debate about public policy, then I'm showing that I'm dissing your comprehensive doctrine. And that's not good if our goal is consensus around fair policies that respect everyone equally. Okay? So this is the kind of view of religious toleration that Rawls at least initially favored. Some people didn't like this. So advocates for some religious perspectives, some religious people had no problem with this. They said, that's fair. We are treated the same as any other religion, so this is okay. We're all right with this. But others didn't. Others said this is wrong. They said, you think, Rawls, that you're being religiously neutral. You think that you're not playing favorites. Well, you're wrong. Because basically what you're doing is your overlapping consensus actually creates a new comprehensive doctrine. It's then privileged as the official state doctrine, because civic virtue says it's the only one that's really welcome in the public square, and this doctrine is non-religious and secular. And we think, actually, Rawls and company, it's not just non-religious, we think it's anti-religious. So we don't like this new comprehensive doctrine, and yet you say in the name of fairness that you are going to impose this comprehensive doctrine on everybody in society, which is exactly contrary to the principles of fairness that you espouse. So this was a serious criticism of Rawls's minimalist scheme of religious toleration. So Rawls took that seriously, and in some of his later work, just before his death, he tried to respond. So here's what some of the things he said. He said, guys, remember, the public square is really a very small part of life. There's many, many places in the private sphere that you can have all kinds of deep, searching, probing discussions about all kinds of ways that your comprehensive doctrines shape and ought to shape public policy. You have your clubs, you have your associations, even conferences like this make it clear that it's okay, even in a public institution such as University of Michigan. Certainly at churches and religious gatherings, you can talk about this. So I'm imposing a very minimal restriction by this idea of toleration and civic virtue. So don't get your knickers in a knot, basically, said Rawls. But he then admitted something, which I think is very, very important in mission. He pointed out that individual citizens, when debating in the public square, actually might refer to their comprehensive doctrines. And he said something extremely important. It has the advantages of citizens informing one another where they come from, so to speak. Now that's a huge, important statement. It basically points out the possibility that if my thoughts on public policy are shaped by my comprehensive doctrine, my Islamic faith, for example, and I go into the public square and I don't make that known, I'm lying. I'm concealing from the folks I'm supposed to be respecting a critically important piece of information that would give them content and context to why I'm making this argument. And Rawls acknowledged that there's a value in not lying like that, in being open, being transparent. So I think that was a very, very important statement that Rawls made. Having made that statement, he then wanted immediately to take it away. He wasn't comfortable. He was sticking his neck out too far, and so he immediately said after that, the duty of civility requires a return to public reason eventually to justify legislation or policy. So I can maybe dabble a little bit, and my comprehensive doctrine teaches me that this is a policy, but forget all that because now I'm giving you a whole lot of reasons that all have to do with the overlapping consensus. So Rawls kind of stuck his neck out a little bit, but he kind of then pulled it back, I'm afraid, in his final writings. Why is Rawls so concerned about this minimal structure? Why is he so afraid of sticking his neck out beyond this bare bones view of religious toleration? Well, there's method there. There's a reason for that, okay? His reason is that since we must reach consensus to assent to the basic principles for the structure of society, a philosophical argument will be strongest to the extent that it appeals to the fewest number of assumptions and the least controversial assumptions. So therefore, Rawls assumed that if you have mutually disinterested parties, each one seeking his or her own advantage, you're making the bare minimum very uncontroversial assumptions. And so philosophically, nobody can claim that you're sneaking your comprehensive doctrine in the back door, and that's what's shaping the basic structure of society. Okay? Now, did Rawls believe morally that we are only mutually disinterested people? Did he believe that none of us are motivated by compassion, by care, by altruism? He didn't believe that for a minute. He knew that the moral life was much, much richer and deeper than mutual disinterest and rationality. But he said that comes later. We'll add that back later on. First, we'll agree on the basic structure of society, and then my work here is done, and then we can add that other stuff in. Okay, so that's his method. That's what he's trying to accomplish. And that method leads to this bare bones, very limited idea of religious toleration, I believe. That's how he gets there. Martha Nussbaum, another very, very prominent contemporary American philosopher who's fortunately still with us, wrote about this, and she said something I think very important by way of criticism. The pursuit of mutual advantage and the success of one's own projects, that is mutual disinterest, is not less than a compassionate commitment to the well-being of all human beings. It's just different. It goes in quite a different direction. So I think what Martha Nussbaum is arguing in her critique of Rawls, that is in this recent volume, Frontiers of Justice, is by eliminating altruism, compassion, benevolence, etc., from his initial assumptions, Rawls may have made a basic fundamental mistake. He imagined he was constructing a foundation, and that on that foundation you could then build a house that included all these wonderful moral values. But if you build your foundation in certain ways, there's certain kinds of houses you cannot build on it. Okay? And Nussbaum is pointing out the possibility that by eliminating certain things from his foundation, he therefore made it very hard, if not impossible, for these things to be later added on. And maybe that was a fundamental failure of Rawls's methodological approach. And maybe what we needed, if we're going to be dedicated Rawlsians in a better way, is to have a richer set of initial assumptions. The idea that we could dispense with them because they could be controversial, maybe paying way too high a price in terms of what that house eventually looks like, that we build on that foundation. Okay? So here's the question. Supposing we look elsewhere in Rawls's theory of justice to see whether he had an idea that he actually could have applied to religion and religious and philosophical diversity, to the diversity of comprehensive doctrines, which would have done him better in terms of a view that avoided Nussbaum's criticism, that led to a better view than mere religious toleration. And I think he had the idea, but he didn't apply it in this particular area. The idea he had was differences among people in society, in a society like ours, in skills and talents that lead to different contributions to economic production are viewed in his schema as a common natural resource, somewhat akin to mineral wealth, clean environment, and so forth. What the heck does that mean? What Rawls is saying here is that I hope that they haven't yet closed all the auto factories in Michigan. So I'm hoping somewhere there's still an auto plant going in Michigan. 2 minutes? Really? Thought we had 10 by my watch. But...
I've got questions. You can go on if you want.
Okay, well let me do the best I can. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so so there's this guy who likes working on the auto assembly line. He's good at it. And he makes good quality cars on that assembly line. And that's his job, and he likes doing it, and he's happy with his job. I would be hopeless if you put me in that job. I would not do a good job at all. That other guy might not do so well if you put him in a classroom with some medical students. Okay? So if everybody was like me, we'd have no cars. If everybody was like him, we'd have no doctors. So it's really good for society that there's this diversity of talents and skills. And the existence of this diversity is a kind of common resource, just like a clean environment is. We can not each of us own it ourselves. It's something that all of us in society must take advantage of as a whole society without private ownership of it. Okay? So this, he says, establishes a principle of reciprocity as a key component of justice. So I think, why don't we think about diversity among comprehensive doctrines the very same way we think about diversity of talents and skills? Why don't we think about the comprehensive doctrine variance, the diversity among comprehensive doctrines, as the same kind of social enrichment, the same kind of natural resource, that all of us in society are richer because this diversity exists? Why don't we view the diversity among religious views, specifically, not as merely something to be tolerated, but as something that enriches all of us and should be nurtured and cherished, not just tolerated? So I think this leads to a Rawlsian view that isn't what Rawls said, but is fully consistent with his basic philosophy. People should be encouraged to express views on public policy honestly and fully, which includes how their comprehensive doctrines ground and shape those views. So if you go into public square and Islam is part of the education, part of the tradition, part of the information that causes you to take a certain stance on a public policy debate, why not be transparent? Why not share with the public square, at the public square? This is where my views come from. This is my grounding. On this basis, I offer these views. Now, there would be some cases where we'd go too far and we really would have disrespect for others, or where we'd end up being very anti-democratic. The burden of proof is on the objector to show that this is one of those circumstances. We can't simply say, oh, it might lead to that. It might be anti-democratic. It might be disrespectful. We have to say, no. This particular way of expressing your views in the public square is anti-democratic. We can prove it. Then we have to say, please don't do that here.